Hi, anatomy students. We are ready to wrap up our skeletal system with notes on fractures. So let's get started. Okay, first of all, a fracture is a break in a bone. A break is a fracture. They're not different. So if someone has a broken bone, they have a fractured bone and vice versa. It's not a different thing. But there are two main types of fractures, and that would be closed and open. Closed means it doesn't break the skin. Open means literally the bone is poking through the surface of the skin. And a closed fracture is also called a simple fracture, and an open fracture is also called a compound fracture. The most commonly broken bones, number one, clavicle, then arm bones, then carpal bones, foot bones, and hips, especially in people over 65. But again, the most commonly broken bone, clavicle. Collarbone. All right, so this video, I'm going to put a link in the description. We're not going to watch it here. All right, so here are some visuals. You can see a closed fracture does not break the skin. An open fracture does. Just a little humor. All right, so why do bones break in the first place? All right, so that means there's more energy or more force applied that is greater than the bone strength. So have a paper clip on there. Think about a paper clip. So paperclip, if you just open it, it's not going to break, but if you bend it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, you can snap the paperclip. So a bone is similar in that if you just apply too much force, it can break. So the paperclip analogy is showing you that repetitive stress, even if it's not of great force, can still cause a bone to break. Okay, so that's what happens with a lot of marathon runners. It's just simply too much repetitive stress. So it could be too much energy, a fall. Also, your bones could be weak. It could be osteoporosis, age, infection, tumor, or too much torsion or twisting. All right, first aid for fractures. First, you want to stop the bleeding, so elevate and apply pressure. Then you want to immobilize the area, keep it from moving. And then you would want to apply some ice to reduce swelling. Okay, so stop the bleeding, immobilize it, and apply ice. Now, how is a doctor going to treat a fracture? Let's talk about it. All right, so a doctor may need to do a reduction. So if your bone is displaced, so they're not lined up nice and neatly, the doctor's going to have to move those bones back in place. This can often be painful because remember, the bones have a lot of nerves involved. So sometimes the doctors are going to do a nerve block to stop, hopefully, a lot of that pain. Immobilize it, so in a splint, in a sling, in a cast. Sometimes it depends on the type of break in which one would be appropriate. In severe cases, it may involve surgery to put pins, screws, rods, or plates in place so that the bone can heal properly. All right, so this I'm going to put a link in the description if you want to watch it. All right, so now let's actually look at the kinds of fractures. So we have, remember, simple, which is closed, open, which is compound, and then we have a displaced, so they don't line up, and then we have non-displaced where they line up completely. So non-displaced, there's a fracture, but they're lined up, and displaced, there's a fracture, but they're not lined up anymore. So we have a transverse fracture, right angle across the bone, blunt force trauma, so a fall, a car accident, something like that. Transverse fracture, straight across the bone. Oblique fracture, the break is diagonal to the bone's long axis. So it could be going up, it could be going down. Again, blunt force trauma from a fall or an accident. Oblique fracture, so it's at an angle, okay? A green stick fracture, so the bone breaks incompletely. This is common in young children. So that means one side of the bone breaks, but the other just bends, okay? So it's just like if you take a stick, a twig that is still green, and you try to break it, it's just bending. That's what happens with a green stick fracture. Okay, so again, it's an incomplete break. It's broken on one side, but not the other. Now, a spiral fracture, that's a ragged break. It's literally from this extreme twisting force. It's common in sports, like if you have a planted foot and the rest of your body is moving, that twisting force can cause a spiral fracture, like in skiing. Red flag, though, a spiral fracture can be a warning sign of abuse in children. It's from like the grabbing and twisting of an arm. Spiral fracture, a ragged break from a twist. Now, a comminuted fracture is where the bone breaks into a whole bunch of pieces, 3 or more. It's from a great deal of force, or if you're elderly and have brittle bones. Okay? Comminuted fracture, breaking into 3 or more pieces. A compression fracture, literally part of the vertebrae collapses. So it can be from trauma, but it can also be from tumors or infection, and also elderly people who have osteoporosis, or someone who's not elderly but has osteoporosis. An avulsion fracture. Remember how an avulsion wound is where part of the tissue actually gets torn away? Avulsion fractures where part of the bone literally gets pulled away. And then we have a depression fracture, where there's a break in the skull where the bone is depressed, pushed in due to extreme impact. So how do fractures heal? Okay, so while casted and while immobile, your bone loses mass. All right, so your bone mass is going to decrease temporarily when you have a fracture, and then it's going to go back up. It may not go back up to what it was before, but it's going to increase back up. And every time you have a fracture, you're going to go through that same process. But if you notice, as you get older, in general, your bone mass just starts to decrease. And if you've had a previous fracture, okay, you may have less bone mass, especially around that area. So at what age do you think someone will be most at risk for fractures? Well, that would be over 60. Okay, so the increased risk of fractures really starts to escalate around age 60. So there are 4 stages to repair a fracture. So first, stage 1 is the break, literally the bone breaks, and there's bleeding, because remember, all those osteons have blood vessels running through them. So there are ruptured blood vessels. So a clot or hematoma forms, and we seal off those blood vessels that are broken. But the problem is, as we seal off the blood supply, then bone cells start to die because now they can't get their nutrients, right? So first stage of bone healing is literally the fracture. The break, you get a hematoma, a blood clot, stop the flow of blood. Second stage is forming a soft callus. So around the outside of the bone, you're going to see a bump, but it's going to be soft. It's going to be made of collagen fibers and cartilage. But it's to help get the process started. The osteoblasts, the bone builders, are going to start the process, but that callus is still really soft and more fragile, right? And then we have phagocytes that are going to come in and kind of clean up all that dead stuff. Remember, without the nutrients, we have some cells dying, so they're going to clean up that stuff. Third stage is a bony callus. So now that callus gets replaced with bones. The osteoblasts are now working extra hard and they're building bone. And it may take about 2 months or so for those ends to be firmly joined together. Okay, so how long it will take, it depends on how long they're going to keep you in a cast until you can have a secure bony callus formed. But if you notice, it forms a bump around the bones. Okay, and now remodeling is next. So it's going to involve a coordinated effort from osteoblast building, osteoclast cleaning, over and over and over in this cycle until the bone looks very similar to what it was before. But there's always going to be an indicator that it was broken. Okay, so if someone looked at your bones later, they would be able to tell you had a fracture there once. This is never going to look exactly the same. Okay, so, and this can take years. All right, so fracture, hematoma, soft callus, bony callus, remodeling. Okay, hematoma from the fracture, soft callus, bony callus, remodeling. All right, so one more time. Fracture, the break, hematoma, soft callus, bony callus, remodeling. And there you have it. That's fractures and remodeling. So hopefully you've enjoyed these lessons on the skeletal system. And soon we're going to be delving into the muscular system. So stay tuned for more lessons.